The new SNP MSP caused quite a stir recently with a tweet about paedophiles, saying that paedophiles are people too, they're not monsters, and it's been very controversial. I'm going to look at that tweet later on in this video and tell you what I think about it. But before we get there, let's do a bit of delving into what else has been going on in Scotland. Now, a couple of months ago in Leith, there was this special event put on, government funded, these things always are. It included a viewing of a documentary about the gay scene in Edinburgh in the 1980s called Coming Out. They were screening this documentary. Q&A with Lavender Menace. Founders Lavender Menace is an LGBT bookshop that existed in Edinburgh for many years. And then someone's written a play about this bookshop and it's now going to be turned into a film, all at taxpayers' expense, obviously. Gray Crosby is speaking at this event. Gray Crosby is the foul-mouthed poet who spends half his time making videos for the BBC and the other half making party election broadcasts for the Green Party. That's obviously a consistent portfolio of activities, isn't it? So let's have a look at this video that's been shown at this taxpayer-funded event for a start, Coming Out.
This week outside the General Assembly, members of the Scottish homosexual rights group staged a protest against a church report which ruled out any possibility of recognising homosexual marriage.
So in the foreground there we see John Heen, a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange. He died just, I think, last year. He's there lobbying people at the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland.
It's a very disappointing attitude. They've debated homosexuality twice before, 67 and in 68. And now they've come up with this report, which is in some ways, further back in time in attitudes.
Well, that's Ian Campbell done there in the documentary. He was the co-founder of the Paedophile Information Exchange, pro-paedophilia campaigning group. He was also there at the General Assembly. You didn't see him in the clip. He was also there lobbying the delegates there as well. Now, these characters, it's well known their involvement with the Paedophile Information Exchange, but the people deciding to show this film obviously aren't too bothered. Right, let's move on to the part of the documentary to do with the Lavender Menace bookshop.
Paul Traynor and Paul Halliday share an Edinburgh flat. They're in love with each other. Both are regular visitors to a new gay bookshop in 4th Street, which at night doubles as a meeting place for the city's gay youth movement.
This bookshop 20, 30 years ago wouldn't have been allowed, and secondly would have been seen as a rather dirty, rather seedy kind of place, and it's a marvellous thing to have this kind of bookshop now.
So Bob Orr, one of the co-founders of the bookshop, is now treated as an honoured guest at these sort of events. Lavender Menace is now an LGBT book archive, and organisations like the Scottish Book Trust deal with them, so I'd imagine a bit of money changes hands there as well. I mean, here's an example of Bob Orr in action at a recent event.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Conversations with Writers Footsteps and Witnesses online event. I'm Cleo Jones and I manage the events for City of Edinburgh Libraries, and I'm really delighted tonight that it's being run as part of our Book Week Scotland programme, and we've been delighted to be able to host tonight's event with our friends and partners from Lavender Menace, Bob and Sigrid.
Good evening, my name is Bob Orr and I'm co-hosting this event with Sigrid Nielsen. Together we run Lavender Menace Queer Books Archive, and we're delighted to welcome you to this evening.
Okay, let's see what Bob Orr has been up to in the past. Let's have a look at the Gay Scotland newsletter from November 1980. Sunday 19th of November, Paedophilia Workshop, Edinburgh branch, organised by the Scottish Human Rights Group Edinburgh, report by Jim Murphy and Bob Orr. About 20 people took part in the workshop, which was held in the Edinburgh Gay Centre. Our aim was to explore our attitudes as lesbians and gay men to an issue which, with the forthcoming trial of members of the Paedophile Information Exchange, looks like being highly topical and controversial. The event took the form of an introductory talk by Roger Moody, a former editor of Peace News and author of the book Indecent Assault, followed by informal group discussions with everyone getting together again for a final exchange of ideas. Roger's introduction was the defence of paedophilia, but in terms which were probably new to most of us. He insisted that the issue directly involved the gay movement, as the majority of paedophiles in his experience were gay men who formed relationships with boys. Roger also took issue with the attitude taken to the paedophile relationships by Paedophile Information Exchange spokespeople. The disparity in power between the partners could not be wished away, but had to be redressed. This could only come about through a radical advance in the effective rights kids were recognised as having, including the right to form sexual relationships with adults. So do you see there? He's saying we've got to be realistic that there's a power imbalance when adults have sex with children, and that's a problem. But the way to solve that problem is to empower children, so we say they have got the right to consent to sex with adults, and then that solves the problem, and then paedophile relationships are then fine. In other words, give children more rights, sexual rights, in other words, and then, let's say, that will justify adult-child sexual relationships. Now, I mean, if Roger had been looking at the sex education curriculum in Scotland, he'd have been delighted with that. That's very much the line being taken. Right, he pointed to the tentative beginnings of a youth emancipation movement in Europe and North America being of key importance. Youth emancipation from oppression. In other words, children's rights. Okay, that's what it amounts to. Giving more rights, more responsibility to children, including the right to choose to enter into sexual relationships with adults. Back to the report. Although no formal statement got drawn up, probably the consensus of the workshop was that a blanket approval or disapproval of paedophile relationships was inappropriate. A lot depended on whether the older partner acted to break down or reinforce assumption of adult control. Okay, so as long as the adult is sort of doing it properly, if you like, in terms of control and power, then that can be okay. If they're not, then it's probably not okay. That seems to be the conclusion of this group. Right, Bob Orr made a proposal, again, put to the meeting. His proposal was to affirm the right of paedophiles and other sexual minorities to organise and publish material without state harassment. Proposed by J. Murphy and R.W. Orr. That's Bob Orr of the Lavender Menace bookshop. Okay, so that's a bit about Bob Orr's opinions. Maybe he's changed his opinions. Maybe he's moved on completely now. I've never heard him say that. It doesn't seem like he has to clarify that at any point at all. It doesn't seem at all controversial to have Bob Orr involved in these contemporary events and lauded by these taxpayer-funded organisations. I always contrast things to my own experience. I mean, I said that kids needed a mum and a dad ideally. The General Teaching Council of Scotland were on my case for 3 years. Police Scotland were on my case, reporting me to my employer as a hate incident perpetrator, etc. Whereas Bob Orr, whose views about paedophilia are, well, let's be generous, let's be very, very generous, ambiguous. He seems to be sort of living a life as an honoured, some minor celebrity in the cosy world of taxpayer-funded sock puppet charities. Now, notice there again, children's rights is the line that's used as a cover for pushing for adult-child sexual relationships. Just a reminder, Dr. Colin Morrison, who's in charge of the sex education resources in Scotland, he writes of the need to break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality, and also all the sex education resources. It's infused with this idea of sexual rights, children's sexual rights, children's rights to explore their own sexuality. And you do wonder what people are thinking behind that. But just another example of something, I just happened to stumble across this on the internet recently. Again, this is a government-funded organisation. It's talking about participatory budgeting, the idea that local people vote about how money gets spent in their local area. And the person saying, why can't children take part? And finishes up by saying this: if not 18, then when? If, like the Scottish independence referendum, we depend on 16 to be able to vote, why not 15? If 12, why not let Sylvie vote at 8? And if Sylvie can vote about what's important in her community, then why should there be any limit to what else she can decide on? Now, I think anyone writing that should immediately think, whoa, what am I saying there? Do I really mean that? You want 8-year-olds to be able to decide on anything about their lives, anything that's important to them? Really? Now, the person who wrote that probably didn't have any thought in their head about this as application to sex with children, basically. They probably didn't enter their head. But this creates an atmosphere where it is in their head, that's exactly what they're pushing towards. It makes it quite easy for them, because lots of other people are pushing in the same direction without really thinking about what they're doing. I mean, just to clarify, not all children's rights activists are child sex advocates, but all child sex advocates are children's rights activists. That's for sure. Right, let's move on to this tweet by the SNP MSP. Here it goes. Right, paedophiles and predators are people, not bogeymen under the bed. Not Mac-wearing flashers in the street, faithless and nameless. There are family, friends and colleagues. They're not scary monsters, they are people who abuse. It's uncomfortable to humanise them because we then have to face the horrors in plain sight. Horrifying, isn't it? Face it and warn our kids. Now, what do you make of that? I mean, the first thing I make of it is just what a mess. It's really confused. It's difficult to understand what it's saying. It seems contradictory. Now, this is the second time I've tried to engage with the thinking of one of the new SNP MSPs. The previous attempt with Emma Roddick, I mean, she seems to inhabit a sort of parallel logical universe with which I'm entirely unfamiliar. And this, as well as a piece of communication, is unclear, to say the least. But I'm trying to give her a fair hearing here to see what she's trying to say, and then I'll respond to it. So, okay, paedophiles, child abusers are not Mac-wearing flashers in the street, faceless and nameless. Well, okay, in some cases they might be, but in many cases they wouldn't be. Okay, so I'm not quite sure the point of saying that. There are our family, friends and colleagues. Okay, yeah, in some cases they're going to be family, friends and colleagues, and that is a relevant warning to people to be on the alert. So yes, okay, fair enough. Paedophiles and predators are people. They are not scary monsters. Now, they're people, not monsters. Yes, quite agree. It doesn't help to dehumanize criminals or abusers, or no matter how terrible the things people do, they're still human beings. If you dehumanize them, then you're not being extra stern or extra hard on them. You're actually letting them off the hook. Because if they're not human, they're not accountable morally for their actions. Okay, so I don't want to dehumanize them. I want them to be responsible for their actions, and therefore to be deserving of punishment because they made a choice. They could have done otherwise than the way that they acted. Now, I think around paedophilia, there is a culture in some quarters of real self-righteousness, moral superiority. It comes out sometimes in sort of vigilante movement as well, and it can be pretty unsavoury, to be honest. And I would say some of the response from the Alba party, I would say, was starting to reflect that sort of mindset, but I would hope to avoid that. Right, the tweet then goes on to say, they are people who abuse. Right, that's a tricky little sentence as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it almost sounds like she's saying, okay, the fact that they abuse children, that's just a side issue. You know, they're a great guy, but they just happen to abuse kids. Let's not label them. Let's not be unkind and unfair to them just because they abuse kids. It sounds as if that might be what she's trying to say, which obviously is not a good sentiment at all. People who abuse, another suggesting they shouldn't be called paedophiles, shouldn't be called abusers. But that's just factual. You know, if you kill someone, you're a murderer. You have become a murderer. Okay, now people might be willing to forgive or rehabilitate, but still the fact's the fact that that's something you've done and it's not going to change it. So you suspect that behind what she's saying here, it's the old stigma thing. We don't want to stigmatize people. You know, just because they're a paedophile, just because they're a child abuser, we don't want to label them. Well, really, I don't think the stigma is really the issue. And even if you decide you want to remove the stigma, which wouldn't be a good thing, you want this behaviour to be stigmatised. I mean, is it really going to change the way people see them? I really think it isn't. They're not scary monsters. Again, it sounds like she's saying, you know, they're not really such bad people after all. Really, I mean, what they're doing is appalling. It's utterly appalling. So to suggest that they're not scary, I've said, monsters I wouldn't want to dehumanize, but again, I'm not quite sure what message she's trying to deliver there. It's uncomfortable to humanize them because we then have to face the horrors in plain sight. Horrifying, isn't it? Face it and warn our kids. Face the horrors in plain sight. Sexual abuse of children is not usually in plain sight. I don't really know what she's saying there. Horrifying, yes, I absolutely agree. What goes on in child abuse is absolutely horrifying. How it can be horrifying, but the people who perpetrate it are not scary, I really struggle to put that together and make sense of it. But yeah, warning children, yes, absolutely. Now, I think that warning children about the possibility of abusers, I think it's necessary. But there's a sad side to it as well. I feel that now that the concept of paedophilia is so prominent in the minds of children that I really think it's sad. I think it results in a loss of innocence and possibly openness to adults as well in some cases. And when you hear children just flippantly and sort of as a joke saying, he's a pedo, you're a pedo, or whatever, and this sort of talk, I think it's sad. It's sad. I'm not suggesting I've got the answer to this, that maybe things have gone too far in alerting people and being too explicit with young children about the dangers. I don't know. Maybe the explicitness and the emphasis is necessary. But if it is necessary, then it's got an unfortunate consequence as well. So to sum up on the tweet, I mean, it's a muddle. It's hard to tell what she's saying. But I'll leave that there. I'll try and say some things from my point of view now about paedophilia, basically. So sexual attraction to children, adult sexual attraction to children. Where does it come from? Well, there are three sources, basically. One source is some people just grow up, they go through their developmental phases, and they just find that is how their sexual orientation develops. So it is a sexual orientation. Instead of being sexually attracted to, for example, adults of the opposite sex or mature people of the opposite sex, they find themselves attracted to children or worse, very young children. Okay, and they often don't want it. They wish it wasn't the case. It frightens them. They're embarrassed by it, but just people find that that's what's developed within them. Right, another way it can arise is through experiences of abuse or other sort of sexual activity or experience or exposure in childhood. So the first one's no one's fault. This one is someone else's fault. And the last way that sexual attraction to children can develop is through pornography. This is where someone might, if you take a man, for example, might start with mainstream pornography. Eventually they get bored with it, so they seek different types. And one direction that exploration can be going to looking at images of younger and younger girls. Maybe initially girls pretending to be younger, and then girls are actually younger. And some men actually turn themselves into paedophiles through pornography, which justified my point that the Scottish government fuels child abuse by endorsing pornography in Scottish schools. I mean, frequency of adult sexual attraction to children, it's obviously very difficult to gather data about it, but I have seen figures that said roughly 1.5% of males, 0.5% of females. They're obviously low percentages, but on the other hand, they're frighteningly high as well. 1.5% of males. That's not an insignificant number there. So this sexual attraction to children has arisen in someone. What do we want them to do? Well, we'd want them to seek help. And there are schemes to help people like that. It's a very private world, but they do exist. And we would want to help them as they also want to avoid becoming child sex offenders. They might need to keep away from children, but they might try to change their sexual desires. They might see how they could suppress them. And some people do. Some people do experience these sexual attractions to children and go through their life never acting on them. And I know, congratulations in that for people who achieve that. Some people suggest that one outlet for people struggling with sexual attraction to children is simulated child porn. Obviously, producing real child porn is highly immoral, but I think if it's like cartoon or computer generated, then that could be okay. I just think absolutely not. Surely that's utterly ridiculous. That's doing the opposite of what you want these people to do. You don't want these people to be fueling their lust for sex with children, basically. I mean, what is that going to lead to? I mean, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? So I don't think that's a good idea at all. And yet some experts do actually recommend that. So you've got some people who experience sexual attraction to children, and they're doing their very best to avoid abusing children. So they're people with a problem, and I think they deserve our sympathy and support. On the other hand, there's some people who are sexually attracted to children, and they're seeking the opportunity to abuse children. They're not seeking to avoid it, they're seeking to act on it. In that case, they're 100% responsible and are deserving of the severest punishment because their actions are utterly evil. It's an outrage when people do that. And so that needs to be the attitude of society, and that's very much my attitude to it as well. So as far as paedophilia is concerned, we've got three attitudes to it, roughly speaking, we could talk about. Number one, that's the attitude of, what's the problem? If we liberated children from like Victorian era oppression, they'd be free to explore their sexuality as they wish. If we could just break down the barrier between childhood and sexuality, then it would be much better for everyone. We'd be getting back to nature. It would be free and positive and wonderful. The only thing wrong with adults having sex with children is just an irrational taboo. If we could just overcome that, then everything will be lovely. Now that view is quite influential. It's not articulated entirely openly. It tends to be quite subtle the way it's there, but it's there. Now when it comes to punishing people who sexually abuse children, these people will tend to think, well, we just need to understand them a little bit better. It's not really something we need to look at punishment. We just need to help and understand. We need to be a bit more understanding and tolerant, by which they mean we don't actually think there's anything wrong with it. So that's view number one. Myself, the Scottish Family Party, we're totally and utterly opposed to view number one. Right, view number two, anyone experiencing sexual attraction to children is a monster, and they just need stringing up before or after they've abused, because these people are the scum of the earth, because we are the really good people. We're the nice people. So there's this sense of like moral superiority, self-righteousness. And the epitome of that you see in prison, where you'll get someone who, say, murdered 6 people, but at least I'm not a paedophile. So they'll really have a go at the paedophile at the end of the row of cells, and everyone hates them because it gives them all someone to feel superior to. So I think on this viewpoint, the disgust that is proper, I think it's proper that we're disgusted by the idea of adults having sex with children. That is a disgusting concept, but the disgust turns into hatred, personal hatred and irrational hatred as well. So that's not something positive. They're things to be avoided. Right, number three, position number three, which I think is the right position. Some people find themselves sexually attracted to children. Okay, and that's a problem that they experience. They deserve our sympathy if and while they're battling against it. If they act on it, then that's an appalling crime, because sex with children is just wrong, it's damaging, and it deserves to be punished severely. So as far as I'm concerned, number three is the correct one, and I think that reflects the take of the Scottish Family Party as well. Now, if you're thinking, oh, the Scottish Family Party sounds a bit soft on paedophiles to me, I'd like a bit more anger and hatred than that. Well, I think our stance on the issue is pretty clear. Think about this question. Does anyone do more than the Scottish Family Party to expose those subtly pushing for acceptance of paedophilia and the sexualisation of children? Does anyone do more than us to fight against that? And I think the answer is no. Okay, thanks very much for watching. I'd like to say thank you to my researcher, again, who brought up a lot of the information that I've shared in this video. Do join the Scottish Family Party if you want to support us in our campaigning. Subscribe to the channel, like the video if you found it interesting. And thanks very much for watching.